Well, thank you so much, Ryan, for coming and giving this interview to us today. I really appreciated reading this book, so thank you for the opportunity of reading it and thinking about interprovincial trade regulations in Canada. It's something that's not really commonly worked in public policy schools in Canada, so I really appreciated having the opportunity to read it. And
Well, thank you.
I prepared two questions for you today. And if I may get into them now, or if you would like to do some intro before that.
Well, it's just a pleasure to be here with you. I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed the book, and I'm looking forward to chatting.
Oh, great, great. So first question is, as you mentioned in the book, interprovincial trade regulations in Canada have been a controversial and complicated issue for many, many years. And I would like to ask, it's actually two questions in one. How do you see the landscape of interprovincial trade evolving in the coming years? And what implications will this have for Canadian businesses and consumers? And the second part of the question is, what do you think are the most pressing challenges facing Canadian policymakers today? And how do you see these challenges evolving in the future?
Okay, I'll start with the first one. May need you to repeat the second one, but
Okay.
in terms of the landscape and sort of where are we moving, I think that the Supreme Court in RV Cuomo resoundingly said in a unanimous decision, we're not really going to be the venue for you guys being the Canadian uh, public and economic actors to resolve trade disputes. Section 121 does not have the meaning that you think it does, meaning it doesn't provide for unfettered free trade. And the Supreme Court also opted not to take an interpretation of Section 121 to have a little bit more teeth to it. And it had the opportunity to bring 121 in line with the WTO's understanding of, how to guard against sort of technical barriers to trade. And it also opted against sort of something a little bit more sort of like the U.S. Dormant Commerce Clause. And because of this, I think we're going to see increasing reversion to the Canadian interprovincial trade agreement ecosystem. And I think that the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, which has this structure, this venue called it's shortened to the RCT, where provinces and their policy specialists can come together and hammer out alignment on, again, rather technical issues like building codes, organic labeling, stuff that, it doesn't sound like a trade barrier on its face, but that's where the friction comes from. It's these discordant regulations on some pretty technical issues. And so the more and more there's alignment, and you might use the model of harmonization or the model of mutual recognition, but the extent to which that provinces can get on the same page with their rules and regulations, again on stuff as minute as building codes, the greater you'll see liberalization of trade.
I think you kind of covered the second part that was what are the most pressing challenges facing Canadian policymakers today?
Well,
Um,
that's still actually there's another component to that one. That's an interesting question because I think not only like part of it is the technical piece, but the other part is that it takes political will and political capital to align and bring a number of actors who may not have the same interests. So let's make it concrete. When a province decides to raise for building codes, when a province decides to raise the maximum height that it can permit the use of timber or lumber for on a build, it's at the expense of cement and steel, arguably. Like it's you've got two stakeholders at that table, and it's a little bit of a trade-off there. Part of the issue with interprovincial trade and liberalization, it doesn't happen just within Canada, but across the world. With greater and liberalized trade, there are economic losers. It causes dislocation, it causes job reallocation and job loss. In a recent study I did with Professor Trevor Toomer at the University of Calgary, and we talked about the idea of mutual recognition. One of the consequences of mutual recognition, which is this idea where if it's certified or licensed or permitted in province A, then it should be deemed so in province B. you could have upwards of 300,000 people sort of moving across provincial lines because of this liberalized structure. Um, so again, like it's the actual getting in the room and aligning, and sometimes policy differences, like in construction codes, it's locally determined. There were fires and there were accidents, and over the decades, rules just spread into two different directions, and it's about reharmonizing. But sometimes the rules are spread, and you have interests that are entrenched in keeping the rules under the status quo rather than shifting them in some other way.
Great. There is a one question that just came that I really found interesting about your book is the fact that almost every beginning of chapter you start with interesting anecdote, and then from this small story piece of history of Canada, you build an argument and all of that, and that's quite unusual for public policy books that is usually very technical and goes straight to the point or talks about regulations. I wanted to ask you like how did you come up with this idea, or if it's something just natural that you always, every time you're writing something, you always try to come from the practical experience to the theory?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I really enjoyed because the story of interprovincial trade really is the story of Canada. So inside the product, margarine was the crux of a big interprovincial trade feud between Quebec and Ontario, and it sort of is a manifestation like inside of this one product that we use on our toast. Some of us use on our toast is also sort of like the pitting of the oil seeds versus dairy farmers, and there's the perennial clash that we have within Canada, and because the story is so expressive of our identity, it just led itself to be anchored in people and in product that span pre-confederation to the present, to really ground it. Because I think another thing that comes with interprovincial trade is like it's very easy to say, oh, we want to liberalize, and then from as a student of policy, you say, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Like it's easy to say, oh, GDP will grow 7% if we sort of reduce our barriers to trade, but you really have to get into a little bit of the specificities. Where can we unlock that growth? What do you mean by that? What rules do we need to change? Where are the issues? Trucks, weight and sizes, first aid kits, and it's, I think, a bit more, but it's always exciting to see it manifest in the efforts of individuals or the clashes over product. You have these impressive figures throughout Canadian history, whether it be George Brown, sort of around Confederation era, or all the very passionate policymakers around the time of 1995 when the first Canadian interprovincial trade agreement was being negotiated. And it's the story of the people who put in so much effort towards Canada's economic union. So bringing those to life, I think, was a very exciting part of the process. I'm glad that you enjoyed that.
Yeah, it was quite an enjoyable reading, to be honest. And I think coming to our last question, I think for me it was one of them, probably not intentionally from your perspective, but for me as a reader, the main takeaway of this book is uh, the importance of responsible context when expressing opinions, even on seemingly simple issues like Section 121 of the Constitution. Because when you first read it seems quite obvious like what it means, and then when you look at the Supreme Court interpretation of that historically, you understand that there's so much more meaning to it, and what are the intentions behind those policies that the provinces are creating. So I would like to know, how do you think we can encourage people to take a more thoughtful and nuanced approach to public discourse in our current and polarized political climate right nowadays?
Absolutely. And I think that the answer to that is very interesting. Like the book itself, like if one were to look at this current state of interprovincial trade in Canada, one would say, how, like, I don't understand it. Like, we have Section 121, which suggests we should have free trade across the borders. We have, this, systems where we all march behind the same flag at the Olympics. Like, why? I don't understand. But then if you put it in context, you're like, oh, wow, since 1867, there's actually been improvement. Like there has been progress on this file. Like if we were to paint it like that. And so it's really doing your homework around an issue, and because it's very simple to come in and say, oh, the current state of affairs is not positive, but what's more powerful and what's more engaging is to do the homework and sort of as you say, like listen to the perspectives when it says 121, but then you have to go in and say, okay, where in the Constitution does it say that? And this was drafted in around Confederation in the latter half of the 19th century. So what did they mean by free trade? Like you have to be open-minded, I think, and that was what was so compelling about this book, is because you're talking about trade, but what does it really boil? It's people's lives, people's economic actors, individuals participating in the economy, and it's about being very mindful for mindful to what you're trying to achieve, and why other people might take a different position than you. Because so in net, I think what we can do is just and the story of interprovincial trade shows us that we have to sort of look at it from a multidisciplinary study, from a multi-time period study, and multi-geographical study. So yeah.
Thank you so much. I really think that's a very valuable lesson to nowadays when we see those discussions online about people giving their own opinions without any like previous studies. It's really actually kind of funny to think about how people talk about things they don't really understand without having this background study. So it's really good to have books like yours that bring this to light and to make us really reflect and think about this kind of issues, and that nothing is as simple as it seems nowadays. So
Mhm.
it was
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no, and like there are trade-offs, right? Like the more liberalized we become, what does that mean? It kind of means that provinces have to, and there has to be a notch down in their autonomy, and there's a little bit in their
Mhm,
ability to govern over themselves, because we're trying to create unified landscape regulatory wise.
mhm.
So you're asking for some provinces to sort of relinquish a little bit their control. So it's like, okay, there's no right answer about this. It's what's
Mhm.
your objective? Do you want maximal growth? Do you want a Canada that can sort of respect subnational jurisdictions and differences across the country? So yeah, yeah, it's making sure that everyone at least understands the issues at stake before they start getting adversarial.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan. I think I'll see you on May 18 in our gala dinner,
Yeah, I'm
and I
looking forward
wish
to
you
it.
the best of luck.
Thank you so much.